The screen door slams behind Martha Caldwell as she hurries across her front porch in rural Georgia, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. A stranger's car has just pulled into her gravel driveway, and without hesitation, she calls out, "Y'all come on in. I've got fresh cornbread in the oven and sweet tea brewing." The family inside that car, tourists from Michigan who simply stopped to ask for directions, will leave 3 hours later with full bellies, a jar of homemade peach preserves, and an invitation to stay the night if they ever pass through again. This scene, replayed in countless variations across the American South for over 2 centuries, seems like the most natural thing in the world. Of course, Southerners are hospitable. It's just who they are, right? But what if I told you that this legendary Southern hospitality, this almost compulsive need to feed strangers and welcome visitors, didn't emerge from some mystical regional character trait, but from a very specific interpretation of Christian duty that took root in the antebellum South and grew into something both beautiful and complicated? The story begins not in the grand plantation houses that dominate our imagination of the Old South, but in the humble cabin of Samuel Davies, a Presbyterian minister who arrived in Virginia in 1747. Davies noticed something troubling about the colonial Anglican churches he encountered. They were cold, formal institutions that served the social elite while largely ignoring the spiritual needs of ordinary farmers, indentured servants, and enslaved people. But Davies brought with him a revolutionary idea borrowed from the Great Awakening, that Christianity should be personal, emotional, and above all practiced through daily acts of love and service to others. He began preaching that the truest test of faith wasn't found in formal church attendance or theological knowledge, but in how believers treated strangers, neighbors, and especially those in need. This message resonated powerfully in the rough frontier communities of colonial Virginia, where survival often depended on mutual aid and where formal social institutions were weak or non-existent. Davies's sermons about practical Christianity gave theological weight to the cooperation that frontier life already demanded. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Davies' emphasis on hospitality as Christian duty would eventually be adopted and transformed by the very plantation elite, whose spiritual complacency he had originally criticized. The wealthy planter families discovered that ostentatious hospitality served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Christian virtue, displayed economic prosperity, and created networks of social obligation that reinforced their political and economic power. By 1820, plantation hospitality had become legendary throughout the South. Visitors to places like Thomas Jefferson's Monticello or Andrew Jackson's Hermitage reported being overwhelmed by the generosity of their hosts, who provided elaborate meals, comfortable accommodations, and gracious entertainment that could last for weeks. But this plantation hospitality contained a dark contradiction that reveals the complex relationship between Christianity and Southern culture. The same families who welcomed white visitors with extraordinary generosity built their wealth on enslaved labor and often treated those enslaved people with shocking cruelty. How could the same Christian principles that demanded hospitality toward strangers coexist with the brutal exploitation of human beings living in the same household? The answer lies in how Southern Christianity developed a sophisticated theological framework that reconciled these contradictions through the concept of hierarchy. Southern ministers preached that God had ordained different social positions for different people, and that Christian love expressed itself differently depending on one's place in that hierarchy. To white visitors, Christian love meant generous hospitality, elegant entertainment, and gracious service. To enslaved people, Christian love meant providing basic necessities, moral instruction, and paternal guidance within a system of bondage that was presented as divinely ordained. This theological framework allowed white Southerners to feel genuinely Christian while maintaining a social system that modern sensibilities recognize as fundamentally unchristian. The Methodist circuit riders who crisscrossed the antebellum South further developed the connection between hospitality and faith, but from a very different perspective. These traveling preachers, men like Peter Cartwright and Francis Asbury, depended entirely on the hospitality of local communities for their survival. They couldn't afford to stay in taverns or hotels, so they relied on Christian families to provide food, shelter, and care for their horses. This created a symbiotic relationship where hospitality became both a practical necessity and a spiritual practice. Families competed to host the traveling preachers, seeing it as both an honor and a religious duty. The preachers, in turn, constantly reinforced the importance of hospitality in their sermons, creating a cultural feedback loop that embedded generous treatment of visitors deep in Southern religious identity. The circuit rider tradition also democratized Southern hospitality in important ways. Unlike plantation hospitality, which was limited to the wealthy elite, circuit rider hospitality was practiced by ordinary farmers, artisans, and small-town families who had little material wealth but could still demonstrate their faith through generous treatment of visitors. These modest families often sacrificed significantly to provide for traveling preachers and their entourages. They would give up their own beds, prepare special meals using precious ingredients, and organize community gatherings that strained their limited resources. But they did so gladly, believing that such sacrifices demonstrated their devotion to God and earned them spiritual rewards that transcended material considerations. The stories that emerged from this tradition became part of Southern folklore and helped establish the region's reputation for extraordinary hospitality. Tales of families walking miles through dangerous territory to invite traveling preachers to dinner, of poor widows sharing their last meal with hungry strangers, and of communities coming together to care for sick visitors, created powerful narratives about Southern character that persist to this day. Hello there, fellow history explorers. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we uncover the surprising stories behind the cultural patterns that shape our world. Before we dive deeper into this fascinating intersection of faith and hospitality, I'm really curious about our global audience today. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Are you perhaps enjoying this with your morning coffee in Tennessee, or maybe it's late evening where you are and you're winding down for the day? And here's another question that might give us some interesting perspectives. What do you do for work? I ask because this story touches so many different aspects of human experience. If you work in hospitality, you might recognize some eternal truths about human nature. If you're in ministry or social work, you'll see how religious ideals get translated into practical action. If you're in business, you might be surprised by how economic systems shaped what we think of as purely cultural traits. The Civil War represents a crucial turning point in the evolution of Southern hospitality, though not in the way you might expect. As Union and Confederate armies marched across the South, traditional patterns of hospitality were both disrupted and intensified. Families who had once competed to provide elaborate entertainment for distinguished visitors now found themselves sharing their meager resources with wounded soldiers, refugees, and displaced families. The wartime correspondence of Mary Chestnut, the famous Confederate diarist, reveals how Christian duty compelled Southern families to continue practicing hospitality even when it meant genuine hardship. Chestnut describes giving away the last of her family's coffee to visiting soldiers while her own children went without, seeing such sacrifice as both patriotic duty and Christian obligation. But the war also exposed the limitations of the theological framework that had justified antebellum hospitality. When Union soldiers appeared at Southern doors demanding food and shelter, many families struggled with the Christian command to welcome strangers. How could you practice hospitality toward enemies who were destroying your community and threatening your family? Some Southern families resolved this dilemma by extending grudging hospitality to Union soldiers while making their disapproval clear. Others refused entirely, claiming that Christian hospitality applied only to peaceful visitors, not armed invaders. Still others, particularly women whose husbands were away fighting, found themselves genuinely moved by encounters with individual Union soldiers who seemed like decent young men far from home, regardless of their political affiliation. These wartime experiences complicated the simple narrative of Southern hospitality as an expression of regional character, revealing it as a complex set of practices that could be adapted, justified, or suspended depending on circumstances. The Reconstruction period brought new challenges to the relationship between Christianity and Southern hospitality. The arrival of Northern missionaries, teachers, and government officials created situations where traditional hospitality expectations clashed with political resentments and racial anxieties. Some Southern families extended genuine hospitality to Northern visitors who came with peaceful intentions, seeing it as their Christian duty regardless of political differences. Others provided minimal, grudging accommodation while making their disapproval clear through subtle slights and cold formality that technically fulfilled the requirements of Christian hospitality while expressing political resistance. The presence of newly freed enslaved people created even more complex situations. Christian doctrine clearly commanded treating all people with dignity and kindness, but social customs and economic interests pushed in opposite directions. Many white Southern families found themselves performing elaborate mental gymnastics to reconcile their religious beliefs with their determination to maintain social hierarchies. The emergence of sharecropping and tenant farming systems during Reconstruction created new contexts for hospitality that reflected these tensions. White landowners often provided housing, food, and other necessities for black tenant families, presenting such provision as Christian benevolence while maintaining economic relationships that kept those families in poverty. Meanwhile, black churches and communities developed their own traditions of hospitality that drew on both African cultural practices and Christian teachings, but operated largely separate from white Southern hospitality traditions. These parallel traditions of hospitality would remain largely separate for nearly a century, creating multiple versions of Southern hospitality that reflected the region's racial divisions. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the romanticization of antebellum hospitality become a central element of the lost cause mythology that reshaped Southern identity after Reconstruction. Writers like Thomas Nelson Page and politicians like Henry Grady promoted nostalgic images of gracious plantation hospitality that conveniently overlooked the exploitation and violence on which such hospitality had been based. This mythologized version of Southern hospitality became a tourist attraction and economic development tool, as Northern visitors flocked to the South seeking authentic experiences of legendary Southern graciousness. Hotels, restaurants, and tourist destinations began marketing themselves using imagery and language that evoked plantation hospitality while avoiding direct references to slavery. The commercialization of Southern hospitality created interesting tensions with its religious foundations. While the original Christian motivations emphasized selfless service to others, the commercialized version focused on economic benefits and regional marketing. Some religious leaders worried that turning hospitality into a business proposition undermined its spiritual significance. The rise of the automobile and improved transportation infrastructure in the early 20th century democratized Southern hospitality in new ways. Middle-class families could now travel across the region, creating demand for hospitality services from ordinary families rather than just wealthy plantation owners. This period saw the emergence of tourist homes, bed and breakfast establishments, and other forms of commercial hospitality that maintained the personal, intimate character of traditional Southern hospitality while operating as businesses. Many of these establishments were run by church-going families who saw their work as a form of Christian ministry as well as economic activity. The Great Depression tested Southern hospitality traditions in ways that revealed both their strength and their limitations. As economic hardship spread across the region, many families found themselves unable to maintain the generous hospitality that their culture expected, creating guilt and social tension. But the Depression also demonstrated the practical value of hospitality traditions during times of crisis. Communities that had strong traditions of mutual aid and generous treatment of visitors proved more resilient during economic hardship, as families shared resources and supported each other through difficult times. Church communities played crucial roles in maintaining hospitality traditions during the Depression, organizing meal programs, temporary housing for displaced families, and other forms of assistance that drew on both religious duty and cultural traditions of generous treatment of those in need. The civil rights movement of the mid-20th century forced another reckoning with the relationship between Southern hospitality and Christian values. The spectacle of violent resistance to integration at schools and public facilities contradicted the image of gracious Southern hospitality, creating cognitive dissonance that many Southern Christians struggled to resolve. Some white Southern Christians responded by arguing that true hospitality required maintaining social order and traditional relationships, presenting segregation as a form of kindness that protected both races from conflict. others found themselves genuinely convicted by the contradiction between their hospitality traditions and their treatment of black neighbors, leading some to support integration as a Christian duty. Black civil rights activists often use the language and expectations of Southern hospitality in their protests, pointing out the contradiction between white Southerners' pride in their graciousness toward visitors and their inhospitable treatment of black citizens. This rhetorical strategy proved particularly effective because it used white Southerners' own cultural values against segregationist practices. The lunch counter sit-ins represented a particularly powerful challenge to Southern hospitality traditions, as black students politely requested service at establishments that prided themselves on Southern hospitality while refusing to serve black customers. The contrast between the students' courteous behavior and the hostile responses they received exposed the racial limitations of traditional Southern hospitality. The integration of hotels, restaurants, and other hospitality businesses during the 1960s forced a reconsideration of what Southern hospitality meant in practice. Some white business owners embraced integration as consistent with Christian principles of treating all people with dignity and kindness. Others resisted, claiming that forced integration violated the voluntary nature of true hospitality. The resolution of these tensions generally moved in the direction of more inclusive hospitality, though progress was often slow and uneven. The economic benefits of tourism and business travel provided practical incentives for more inclusive practices, while changing religious attitudes emphasized the universal application of Christian love and service. The late 20th century saw the emergence of a new synthesis that maintained traditional Southern hospitality practices while extending them across racial lines. This evolution wasn't always smooth or complete, but it represented a genuine attempt to preserve valuable cultural traditions while eliminating their discriminatory elements. The role of Southern churches in this transition varied considerably. Some religious communities led the way toward more inclusive hospitality, while others resisted change or limited their welcome to people who shared their theological and social perspectives. But overall, the Christian foundations of Southern hospitality provided theological resources for those arguing for more inclusive practices. The contemporary tourist industry in the South continues to market Southern hospitality as a distinctive regional characteristic, though with important changes from earlier eras. Modern Southern hospitality marketing emphasizes warmth, friendliness, and generous service while generally avoiding the hierarchical and exclusionary elements of historical practice. This commercial version of Southern hospitality has spread far beyond its original geographic boundaries, influencing hospitality practices across the United States and internationally. Hotel chains, restaurant groups, and other service industries have adopted Southern hospitality as a brand identity that promises personalized, generous service to customers regardless of their background. The globalization of Southern hospitality has created interesting questions about authenticity and cultural appropriation. When a hotel in Tokyo or Dubai markets itself using Southern hospitality imagery and language, what relationship does that have to the historical Christian traditions that originally shaped these practices? Some critics argue that the commercialization and globalization of Southern hospitality has stripped it of its spiritual significance, reducing meaningful religious practices to marketing slogans and customer service techniques. Others contend that the spread of hospitality ideals represents a positive development that makes valuable practices available to broader audiences. The role of contemporary Southern churches in maintaining hospitality traditions remains significant, though it takes different forms than in previous eras. Church fellowship meals, visitor welcome programs, and disaster relief efforts continue to emphasize generous service to others as expressions of Christian faith. Many Southern churches have also expanded their understanding of Christian hospitality to include social justice advocacy, environmental stewardship, and community development work. Seeing these activities as contemporary expressions of the same religious principles that once motivated individual acts of generous treatment toward visitors. The immigration of new populations to the South has created opportunities for Southern hospitality traditions to engage with different cultural practices around welcome and service. Latino, Asian, and other immigrant communities have brought their own traditions of generous treatment toward visitors, creating cross-cultural exchanges that enrich regional hospitality practices. These cultural exchanges have also highlighted the distinctively Christian elements of traditional Southern hospitality, as communities with different religious backgrounds bring different theological and philosophical frameworks to bear on questions of service and welcome. The digital age has created new platforms for Southern hospitality, as social media, online reviews, and digital marketing allow businesses and individuals to promote their hospitality practices to global audiences. TikTok videos of Southern grandmothers cooking for unexpected visitors can now reach millions of viewers, spreading Southern hospitality narratives far beyond their original context. This digital amplification has both preserved and transformed Southern hospitality traditions, making them more visible while also subjecting them to global scrutiny and commentary that previous generations of practitioners never experienced. The COVID-19 pandemic created unique challenges for hospitality practices rooted in physical proximity and shared meals. Many Southern families and churches had to find new ways to express generous service while maintaining social distance, leading to innovations like drive-through meal programs and contactless care packages. These adaptations demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of hospitality traditions, while also highlighting their essential spiritual elements. The desire to serve others and express care through practical assistance remained constant even when the specific forms of expression had to change. Looking toward the future, Southern hospitality faces questions about sustainability, authenticity, and relevance in an increasingly diverse and globalized region. The Christian foundations that originally shaped these practices provide resources for addressing these challenges, but they also raise questions about how religious traditions can evolve while maintaining their essential character. The environmental implications of traditional Southern hospitality, particularly its emphasis on abundant food and elaborate entertainment, create tensions with contemporary Christian environmentalism that emphasizes stewardship and sustainability. Some communities are finding ways to maintain generous service while reducing environmental impact, but these adaptations require careful consideration of what elements are essential and what elements can be modified. The increasing religious diversity of the South creates opportunities for Southern hospitality traditions to engage with different faith traditions that have their own practices around welcome and service. These interfaith encounters can enrich hospitality practices while also raising questions about the specifically Christian character of traditional Southern hospitality. The economic inequality that characterizes much of the contemporary South creates challenges for hospitality practices that originated in communities with different economic structures. How can generous service be practiced authentically in contexts where some community members have abundant resources while others struggle with basic necessities? Some Southern churches and communities are addressing these challenges by emphasizing reciprocal hospitality that allows all community members to serve others according to their abilities and resources, rather than assuming that hospitality flows only from those with economic advantages to those without. The legacy of Southern hospitality's entanglement with slavery and segregation continues to influence contemporary practice and perception. Honest reckoning with this history enables more authentic hospitality that acknowledges past failures while working toward more inclusive and equitable expressions of generous service. This historical awareness has led some communities to develop explicit commitments to hospitality that welcomes all people regardless of race, ethnicity, economic status, sexual orientation, or other characteristics that were once used to limit or exclude people from Southern hospitality practices. The story of how Christianity shaped Southern hospitality reveals the complex relationship between religious ideals and cultural practices. Noble theological principles about love, service, and welcome to strangers took root in specific historical contexts that shaped their practical expression in ways that sometimes contradicted their spiritual foundations. Understanding this history can help contemporary practitioners of hospitality, whether in business, ministry, or personal life, recognize both the value and the limitations of cultural traditions, enabling more thoughtful and inclusive approaches to generous service. The enduring appeal of Southern hospitality suggests that it addresses genuine human needs for welcome, care, and generous treatment that transcend specific cultural contexts. The challenge for contemporary practitioners involves preserving the valuable elements of these traditions while eliminating their exclusionary and exploitative aspects. Perhaps the most important lesson from this history involves recognizing hospitality as a spiritual practice that requires ongoing reflection, adaptation, and commitment to treating all people with dignity and genuine care. When hospitality becomes routine or superficial, it loses its spiritual significance and becomes vulnerable to corruption by other motives. The Christian foundations of Southern hospitality provide resources for this ongoing work of reflection and renewal. The biblical commands to welcome strangers, serve others, and love neighbors as ourselves remain relevant regardless of changing cultural contexts, providing guidance for practices that honor both tradition and contemporary understanding of human dignity. Martha Caldwell still offers sweet tea to strangers who stop by her Georgia home, though she now serves it in glasses purchased at Walmart rather than inherited china, and she's just as likely to welcome visitors from Somalia or South Korea as from Michigan. The impulse remains the same: the deep conviction that treating others with generous care honors God and builds beloved community. That conviction, shaped by centuries of Christian teaching and cultural practice, continues to influence how many Southerners understand their obligations to others and their place in the world. The forms may change, but the essential spirit of Southern hospitality, at its best, represents an enduring testimony to the power of religious ideals to shape human behavior in positive ways. The story continues to evolve as new generations of Southerners wrestle with the heritage they've inherited, working to preserve what's valuable while discarding what's harmful, always striving to practice the original vision of generous love that brought Southern hospitality into being in the first place. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the surprising religious roots of one of America's most famous cultural traits. I'd love to know, have you experienced Southern hospitality firsthand? If you're from the South, how do you see these historical patterns playing out in contemporary life? And for viewers from other regions or countries, do you recognize similar connections between religious traditions and cultural practices in your own communities? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Professor Archive for more explorations of how faith, culture, and history intersect in unexpected ways. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep discovering the complex stories that make us who we are.